Yeah, this understanding here about as white women ignore their built-in privilege of whiteness and define women in terms of their own experience alone, then women of colour become other, the outsider whose experience and tradition is too alien to comprehend. And you know, I mean, that's why it goes back to the title of the book, really, the sister outsider thing, that it's if somebody who is in a position of privilege, a white woman who is in a position of privilege, but they ignore that, and you know, they suddenly see, you know, again, that whiteness is the norm, that whiteness is the normality of everydayness. Then it does start putting anybody else's difference, which could be around women of colour, could also be about different sexuality, could be about these things, but othering, and I really do think that there is a sense that staff, you know, people that are, you know, teachers, people that are working at the university, you know, there is this sense of being very liberal. There's this sense of, you know, liberal education. We're talking about arts education, which is even more liberal. Mm-hmm. You could say, in a sense of, you know, if we wanted to be very stereotypical, we could say science and maths. No, it's not science and maths. It's arts and design. So there's always this freedom. There's always this space. There's always this discussion about identity, where the reality is that's not actually the case. So that's not always the case. And actually, when people start talking about diversity and equality, people think, oh, it's other people. It's over there. It's nothing to do with me. So I think it's very, you know, I think that's very, very important. And I think it goes on to the final quote here, which is that, you know, the true focus of revolutionary change is never merely the oppressive situations we seek to escape, but that piece of the oppressor which is planted deep within each of us. And I think that's actually, I think out this book, I think that's one of the key things that I will take away from it anyway, because I was reading it last night and I thought that is actually profound, okay? Because that is actually saying that if you're really looking at communication, then and understanding about change and revolutionary change, that it is important that you're not just outside, you have to look inside, and everyone has to look inside.
I think that's very powerful. Again, you know, coming back to Freire, I mean, he's talking about the same thing. He talks about the internalization of oppression, which is the internalization of the master narrative, as it were. And you know, I think Bourdieu talks about that in terms of symbolic violence, the way in which symbolic violence itself is deeply kind of rooted within our own selves and self-hatred, you know, some of that very strong language. And the very powerful thing about this is that the process of othering is the mechanism whereby we set up the conditions where you have to make a choice. You know, if you're othered, and othering, as Derrida tells us, is never a kind of a equal process. It's always a kind of in a hierarchy. And if you lie at the kind of the bottom side of that, then your other becomes negatively, you know, pathologically understood, and particularly children don't want to associate with those things. And there's some very interesting experiments that were done with looking at, you know, showing like dolls to children, black dolls, you know, Asian dolls, white dolls, and the work was done by Horowitz and others, and you know, in the 50s, and horrifically the black children were choosing the white dolls, not only in terms of what they desired, but also what they felt looked like them, which was how deep-rooted that internalization. And if that's the condition that you're left with, then, you know, no wonder then, you know, you can't really, as it were, you can't really embrace your own resources, because you're constantly trying to deal with that anxiety inside. I think she it's a deeply kind of psychological understanding of oppression, really, there. And that, in a sense, usefully leads on to, I think, the other quote that had a profound impact, amongst others, on my own kind of, if you like, a kind of view of politics and the pedagogy, which was the one that she talks about, this notion of the mythical norm. Somewhere on the edge of consciousness, there is what I call a mythical norm, which each one of us, and when she says each one of us, I think she's addressing everybody. She's not addressing black women, she's addressing everybody. Each one of us within our own hearts knows that is not me. In America, this norm is usually defined as white, thin, male, young, heterosexual, Christian, and financially secure. She says usually defined because she realised that was at the time when she was making this observation. It is within this mythical norming that the trappings of power reside within this society. Though those of us who stand outside that power often identify one way in which we are different, and we assume that to be the primary cause of all oppression, forgetting other distortions around difference, some of which we ourselves may be practicing. I think there's three things that I think I take from this. One of them is she said, you know, we can't reduce people down to these kind of singular identities, these binary identities. And in fact, you know, here I think also some of the theories around intersectionality. Audre Lorde is already laying some of the groundwork for that, that we are complex, we are othered in many ways, we are different in many ways. So that's the first thing, is that we are not just one of those categories. And that's important because if we're involved in anti-oppressive struggles or liberation struggles, maybe around anti-racism or feminism, whatever, she's saying because we're not reducible to that one identity, then we may be the oppressor and the oppressed at the same time. But we would only become the oppressor if we invoke those mythical norms. Yeah. So she's, you know, the second point is she's saying we need to expose the mythical norm for what it is. It's a myth. And you know, and I think the other interesting thing about this is when she talks about thin and young, she's actually saying that even those people that might have those privileges, you know, white, heterosexual, and they might be thin and they might be young, they're not going to remain young forever. They might not be able-bodied, although she doesn't mention that there.
No.
And therefore, every human being has an investment in trying to construct a, if you like, a politics or a kind of culture or society in which we try to do away with this notion of normality. And therefore, diversity or difference or cultural diversity, celebrations of diversity become something that's not seen as an obstacle to creating cohesion, but it's seen as the very essence of how we begin to live with each other as human beings. So there's a kind of universalism in that. It's a kind of unity in diversity. And that's, I think she speaks powerfully about that.
I think that's really important because I do think that is about moving it from the side, moving it from something that the othering again to something that actually making it the core. Particularly when you're talking about pedagogy, and particularly if you're talking about art and you're looking at sort of European art and you're thinking about, you know, what are we looking at, who are the artists, but actually if we're moving that and just saying, oh, we're going to do something about diversity now, it's like other to the side, to actually say, no, this is the key thing that we're doing. This is the key thing we're doing. We're going to reflect on it. We're going to unpack it. We're going to look at it. And then from doing that, we're then going to be creating this understanding about pedagogies of difference and diversity. So it actually becomes the key point that we do as opposed to a separate thing.
The other interesting thing is that another way to look at this is to look at the relationship between the centre and the margin. And certainly power lies at the centre, and we need to find ways of decentering power. But Audre Lorde is also saying that actually marginal positionality isn't a position of deficit, but actually that is where all kinds of interesting creative processes are taking place. It's in those different, it's recognising difference and diversity. So in some senses, there's a kind of poverty of this kind of adopting a position of normality. There's a kind of non-identity, and you know, and often when we talk about whiteness and we try to define whiteness, it becomes very difficult. It becomes a kind of undefined identity, and I think what Audre Lorde would say is that we need to push whiteness to the margins as well. We need to see whiteness as itself an expression of certain cultural kind of manifestations, however they appear to us.
And I think that's what Angela Davis said as well in the talk. That's exactly what she said, that why are we using the same norms? Why are we using these norms? We need to be looking elsewhere. You know, why are we using the master's tools? We're not going to use those master's tools to destruct the master's house. So I thought that was very powerful because it actually made you think, you know, why are we trying to reach something like that, that actually is, it's about profit, it's about, it's about where things fit, and actually I thought that was very powerful when you're looking about how to go forward. It isn't that, well, we just need to do exactly what's happening now, but in a different way. No, it's like, no, we need to be looking somewhere different to do this. But I totally agree with you about the margins being very, very powerful, and understanding around cultural capital and who has it and what does that really mean, and moving on from Bourdieu about understanding it, where that comes from is about, particularly within art and taste, but understanding that there are other places that actually are just as, if not more, there's more capital, social capital, and cultural capital in other spaces, okay, which what you would say the mainstream or the normal don't have access to. They don't have access to it. And that's actually important to be aware of as well. So
well, that's important. You see, one understanding of Bourdieu's work is that if you become marginalised, somehow you have less cultural capital. Actually, I think the way to understand it is that your cultural capital doesn't have much currency within the kind of currency of the norm, whiteness, as it were. But even if you look at, say, the work of Edward de Bono on lateral thinking, he's kind of, in a sense, talking about the same thing, is that if you want to solve the problems of the world, you don't go to normality to solve the problems of the world, because that simply confirms the prejudices of the world. You have to go to disruptive thinking. You have to go to people who are outside of that norm, and can actually help us to disrupt the directions of travel. So I think it's a very powerful thing. I think we've got one last quote, and we wanted to reflect on. Did you have one?
I think I did.
Okay.
I think that was it. I mean, I want to go back to disruption, because I do think this whole idea of disruption is something that's talked a lot about within art and design, actually, at the moment. A lot of it is a sense of, that we've got to do disruptive acts, and that actually, art and design is about kind of taking a critical view and a standpoint and things like that. And, there are whole conferences that are about disruptive acts in art and design. So I do think that's... what I feel about Audre Lorde is that she is somebody that, just like Freire, somebody that we need to be looking at, discussing, reading, reflecting on, thinking about relates to us in our own positions. And we're educators, we're in higher education, there are a number of other pressures that are happening elsewhere, but to keep this space and to understand that actually she does bring some very important kind of triggers or challenges that people need to start thinking about. Like you say, not saying here's the answer, but just those questioning, which is a really important thing to be looking at.
So in some senses, Audre Lorde's work around challenging normality, being disruptive, in an arts context, should be, kind of meat and drink, as it were. It should be the very essence. And, I certainly think that if some of these writings are not appearing on the curriculum, then it's an impoverished curriculum.